Life had always been a grind. Every day felt like I was pushing a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down the next morning. I worked at a small grocery store, stocking shelves, running the cash register, and sometimes staying late into the night to make up for the constant understaffing. My wife, Amy, had a job too, but it wasn't much better. She worked at a hotline, answering calls from people at their worst, all day long. Between our two jobs, we barely scraped by. Rent was a struggle, car payments were a nightmare, and God forbid we had any surprise expenses. There was simply no room for error. Amy used to be full of life, always positive even when things were tough, but over the past couple of years, I noticed a shift in her. She became more frustrated, impatient, and distant. I couldn't blame her. We were both exhausted. We wanted more out of life, but the reality was we couldn't afford it. Any hope of living comfortably seemed like a distant fantasy. One night, after another exhausting day, Amy sat me down at the kitchen table. I could tell by the look in her eyes that she had something serious on her mind. "We can't keep living like this, Jake," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "We're stuck in this cycle, and nothing is going to change unless we do something about it." I nodded. She wasn't wrong. But what could we do? Work more hours? That didn't seem possible, considering we were already stretched so thin. "What are you thinking?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation hopeful, though deep down, I wasn't sure there was a solution. She hesitated for a moment, biting her lip before blurting it out. "We should play the lottery." I almost laughed. "The lottery? Really, Amy?" "I'm serious, Jake," she insisted, her eyes lighting up with the kind of hope I hadn't seen in her for months. "People win all the time. Why not us?" I wanted to dismiss the idea as ridiculous. But looking at Amy, seeing how much she needed something to cling to, I decided to play along. "Fine," I said, trying to sound casual. "What's the harm in trying?" We started buying tickets, just a few at first, whenever we could spare the extra cash. It was nothing serious, just a little flicker of hope in the back of our minds. But after weeks of no results, I stopped paying attention to the lottery altogether. Life went on as usual: work, bills, exhaustion, repeat. Then one Saturday night, everything changed. I had just come home from a long shift at the store, ready to collapse into bed, when I heard Amy screaming from the living room. At first, I thought something was wrong. I ran in, half expecting to see some kind of disaster. But instead, there she was, standing in front of the TV with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. "We won, Jake. We won!" she shouted, jumping up and down like a kid. My heart stopped for a moment. "Won what?" I asked, still trying to process what she was saying. "The lottery. We won the lottery." I stared at her, completely stunned. "How much?" $20 million. It didn't feel real at first. $20 million? That kind of money only existed in movies or in the lives of people you read about in the news. Not for people like us. But it was real. After years of struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, barely keeping our heads above water, we had finally hit the jackpot. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. We met with financial advisors, sold our old apartment, and moved into a mansion in one of the nicest neighborhoods in town. We bought new cars, took vacations, and for the first time in forever, I didn't have to worry about money. Life was perfect, or at least it seemed that way. For a while, Amy and I were closer than ever. We had always dreamed of having a life where we didn't have to constantly worry about making ends meet, and now we were living it. I thought this was our fresh start, the thing that would fix all the cracks that had started to form in our relationship over the years. We could finally breathe, enjoy life, and maybe even start thinking about the future: kids, more travel, building the life we'd always wanted. But slowly, things began to change. Amy, who had once been so focused on making our life better together, began to drift. At first, it was small things. She'd spend more time shopping, going out with friends, and staying out later than usual. I didn't think much of it. She deserved to have fun after all we'd been through. But soon, it became more frequent, and her nights out became more extravagant. Dinner with friends turned into clubbing, and weekends that were once spent with me were now spent at high-end parties with people I'd never met. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something was wrong. The more money we spent, the more distant she became. We had everything we'd ever dreamed of, but it seemed like it wasn't enough for her. Something was shifting in our relationship, and I was about to find out just how deep that change went. At first, I tried to convince myself that Amy's newfound lifestyle was just her way of enjoying the wealth we never had before. Who could blame her? After years of scraping by, we had the money to experience the finer things in life. I figured she deserved it, but the late nights began to stretch into something more, something I couldn't ignore. It started innocently enough. She'd meet her friends for dinner. But soon, these casual outings turned into nights where she wouldn't come home until well past midnight, sometimes not until the early hours of the morning. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh it off. Just having fun, she'd say, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear like it was no big deal. And maybe it wasn't at first, but her nights out were becoming more frequent, and they were definitely getting wilder. There were nights when I'd sit up, waiting for her. The house was big and empty without her, a hollow shell of what I thought our life was supposed to be now. I'd check my phone every few minutes, wondering when she'd walk through the door, or if she'd even bother texting to tell me when she'd be home. The text stopped after a while, too. It was as if I had become an afterthought in her world of parties, flashing lights, and drinks with people who were strangers to me. One night, Amy came home especially late around 3 a.m. She stumbled into the house, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor, and I could tell she'd had too much to drink. I didn't say anything at first. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV, but my mind had been racing for hours. She walked past me without a word, heading straight to the bedroom. The smell of perfume mixed with alcohol lingered in the air, and something else, something I couldn't quite place, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't the scent of the woman I had known for years. That's when it hit me something was definitely wrong. The next day, I found her phone lying on the kitchen counter. She had gone out to run errands, and the temptation to check it gnawed at me. I'd never been one to snoop before, but my gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. I unlocked her phone, feeling a little sick to my stomach as I scrolled through her messages. Most of them were harmless. Chats with friends, pictures of our house, and the occasional joke. But then I saw the name Luke. It was a name I didn't recognize, and the messages between them were different. Flirty, casual, but with an underlying tone that set off alarm bells. Had a great time last night. Let's do it again soon, winky face, his last message read. My chest tightened, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Who was this Luke? And why was my wife spending time with him, especially when she wasn't even bothering to tell me where she was going anymore? I confronted her about it that evening. She came home late again, this time without the smell of alcohol but still carrying that air of detachment. I waited until she sat down, her face buried in her phone, completely uninterested in whatever small talk I was trying to make. Amy, who's Luke? I asked, my voice calm but firm. She froze for a second, her eyes flickering with a hint of surprise before she quickly composed herself. He's just a friend, she said, her voice a little too casual for my liking. Why? I saw the messages. It doesn't seem like you're just friends, she scoffed, putting her phone down and crossing her arms. Are you seriously going through my phone now? I didn't think you were the jealous type, Jake. Don't turn this around on me, I said, trying to keep my cool. You've been coming home late, spending more time with these so-called friends than with me. What's going on? She rolled her eyes and stood up, clearly annoyed that I was even bringing it up. I told you, nothing is going on. We won the lottery, Jake. I'm just enjoying our life for once. Why can't you just let me have fun? Because I feel like I'm losing you, I blurted out before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I saw something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe? But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same cold indifference I'd been seeing for months. You're being paranoid, she said, shaking her head. I'm not doing anything wrong. I wanted to believe her, but something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling me the whole truth. The late nights, the messages, the way she avoided any real conversations with me, it was all adding up to something bigger. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the truth was becoming harder to deny. As the weeks went on, her nights out became more frequent. She'd come home at strange hours, sometimes not even bothering to slip into bed with me anymore. The excuses were always the same, just out with friends, or I lost track of time, but I wasn't stupid. I knew there was more to it. Then there were the comments on her social media. Men I didn't know, leaving heart emojis or comments like, "Can't wait to see you again." I tried to bring it up with her, but every time I did, she'd shut me down, saying I was overreacting. It was during one of those nights when she came home late again that I made up my mind. Something had to be done. I couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. So, while she was out one evening, I installed a small hidden camera in the house. I felt dirty doing it, like I was invading her privacy, but I needed to know the truth. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, wondering whether or not the woman I loved was betraying me. And it wasn't long before the camera revealed what I had feared all along. I had never been the kind of guy to pry. Trust was a fundamental part of any relationship, and Amy and I had built our marriage on it, or so I thought. But lately, I'd been pushed beyond my limits. The late nights, the flirty messages, and the constant excuses had eaten away at me like a slow poison. I needed the truth, even if it meant confronting the ugliest version of it. The first time I reviewed the footage from the hidden camera, I half hoped it would reveal nothing, that I was just being paranoid. Maybe Amy was right. Maybe I was overthinking things, and she really was just blowing off steam with her friends. But deep down, I knew better. It didn't take long for the camera to confirm my worst suspicions. A few nights after I set it up, Amy came home just after midnight. Her heels clacked across the floor as she entered the house, but instead of heading straight to the bedroom like she normally did, she paused in the living room. She pulled out her phone, texting someone, and then sat on the couch, staring at the screen with a small, satisfied smile. She looked different, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the tired, frustrated Amy I knew, but someone else, someone distant. And then, out of nowhere, she pulled a small compact mirror from her purse and checked her face, dabbing her lips with gloss. Why would she do that if she was just coming home? She wasn't preparing for me, that much was clear. My stomach twisted into knots as I watched her carefully apply her makeup in the mirror, a gesture that seemed absurd given the hour. When I checked her phone later, the pieces began to fall into place. Luke's name was there again, right at the top of her messages. "See you tomorrow night," winky face it read. She had sent it just before walking through the door. I didn't need more proof than that, but what I found was just the beginning. The camera captured her again the following week. This time, she came home even later, around 2 a.m. There was a different look in her eyes that night, like she had been somewhere she didn't want me to know about. She moved quickly through the house, barely glancing around, and headed straight to our bedroom. I rewound the footage, my heart pounding in my chest, when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The faint outline of another man's jacket draped over her arm. It wasn't mine. My head spun as I rewound the footage, watching her carefully drape the jacket over a chair in the living room. The smell of unfamiliar cologne had been lingering in the house for weeks, and now I knew why. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. This was happening. I knew I had to confront her, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed more than just a hunch and blurry camera footage. I needed something concrete. So, I did what any desperate man would do. I started tracking her movements. Using the same hidden camera setup, I began watching her patterns. I noticed she was going to the same places repeatedly, meeting the same people. And it wasn't just dinners or drinks with friends. She was disappearing for hours at a time, sometimes in the middle of the day. She started dressing differently, two clothes I hadn't seen before, more expensive, more revealing. They didn't match the woman I used to know. Then came the day I found the hotel receipt. I had gotten home early from work, trying to shake off the sense of doom that had been building in me for weeks. As I walked through the front door, I noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter. It wasn't hidden, just casually left out like it was nothing. I opened it, and there it was, a receipt for a luxury hotel in the city. She had been there just the night before. Room 204. 2 guests. I felt like the ground had disappeared from beneath my feet. She wasn't just sneaking around behind my back. She was staying in hotel rooms with someone else, someone who wasn't me. I couldn't breathe. I crumpled the receipt in my hand, the rage boiling inside me. I wanted to march straight to her office and demand answers, but I knew that wasn't the right move. I needed more than just rage. I needed proof, and I needed to make sure that when I confronted her, there was no way she could wiggle out of it with excuses or lies. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. It felt surreal, sitting in a dimly lit office with a man I had only just met, explaining my suspicions about my wife. He listened patiently, nodding in understanding. "You're not the first, and unfortunately, you won't be the last," he said, his voice low and matter-of-fact. We agreed that he would follow her, gather information, and give me a full report within a week. It felt like a betrayal of trust to go behind her back like this, but then again, Amy had already betrayed me. A few days later, the investigator called. His voice was calm, professional, as he told me what I had feared all along. Amy wasn't just sneaking around with some casual fling, she was deeply involved with Luke, the man she'd been texting for months. They had been seen together multiple times, in and out of different hotels, bars, and restaurants. When he sent me the pictures, I stared at them in disbelief. There she was, my wife, holding hands with another man, laughing with him, looking at him the way she used to look at me. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She had checked out of our marriage, and I hadn't even realized it until now. Everything was piling up: the messages, the hotel stays, the nights out, and the coldness between us. There was no denying it anymore. I had all the proof I needed. And now, it was time to confront her. It was a Friday night, and Amy had texted earlier to let me know she'd be out with friends again. This time, though, I wasn't going to let her lies slide. I had everything I needed: the messages, the hotel receipt, the photos from the investigator. Tonight was the night I would confront her, and there would be no way for her to escape the truth. I sat in the living room, the hidden camera footage playing in a loop on my laptop, waiting for the sound of her car pulling up. My heart raced as I rehearsed the conversation over and over in my mind. How was she going to react? Would she deny it? Get angry? Try to turn it around on me? I had no idea, but I knew I had to be ready for anything. The clock struck 1:30 a.m. when I heard her stumble through the door. The sound of her heels echoed across the hardwood floor, and I could hear her drop her purse carelessly onto the hallway table. This had become a routine for her: late nights, no explanation, acting as if nothing was wrong. But this time, things were different. "Amy, we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady as she walked into the living room. She looked surprised to see me still awake, but quickly masked it with an indifferent shrug. "Can't this wait until morning?" "I'm exhausted," she muttered, kicking off her shoes and heading towards the stairs. "No, it can't," I replied, my tone firmer than I intended. "Sit down." She hesitated for a moment, then turned around and gave me an annoyed look before plopping down on the couch. "What's this about, Jake?" I took a deep breath, pulling up the photos from the private investigator on my laptop. I turned the screen towards her without saying a word. Her eyes flicked down to the screen, her expression unreadable at first. But then I saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, quickly replaced by a cold, defensive glare. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice suddenly sharp. "You know exactly what this is," I said, leaning forward. "Don't play dumb, Amy. I know about Luke. I know about the hotels, the lies, everything." For a split second, she looked like she might try to deny it. Her mouth opened, as if she was about to launch into another round of excuses, but then something shifted in her expression. She sighed heavily and ran a hand through her hair, slumping back against the couch as though the weight of her deception had finally caught up to her. "Okay, fine. You want the truth?" she said, her voice suddenly calm, almost too calm. "Yes, I've been seeing someone else. Are you happy now?" Her admission hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I had already known. Hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that all the evidence in the world couldn't. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" she snapped, her frustration flaring. "What difference does it make now?" I clenched my fists, trying to keep my emotions in check. "How long, Amy?" I demanded again, this time more forcefully. She rolled her eyes, as if the whole conversation was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. "A few months, all right? Maybe longer. I don't know." How could she be so indifferent? So uncaring about what she was doing to us, to me? "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking slightly. We had everything. After all those years of struggling, we finally had a life we could enjoy. Why wasn't that enough for you? She let out a bitter laugh. Enough? Jake, this life wasn't enough for me. The house, the cars, the money, it's all great. Sure. But you? You're still the same boring guy I married when we had nothing. You never changed. I did. Her words stung more than I thought they would. I had always tried to be the steady rock in our relationship, the one constant she could rely on. But now she was throwing that back in my face like it was a flaw. So, this is my fault? I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief. You're blaming me for your cheating because I didn't change? No, it's not your fault, she said, her tone softening for a moment. It's just, I wanted more. More excitement, more freedom. And Luke, he gave me that. I shook my head, feeling the rage bubbling up inside me. So, you threw away our marriage for some guy you met at a club? For what? A few nights of excitement? It's not just about that, she said, standing up now, pacing the room. I'm not the same person I was, Jake. I can't go back to pretending like I'm happy in this dull, predictable life. And what about me? I asked, standing up to face her. Did you ever think about what this would do to me? To us? She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes cold and unfeeling. I can't keep living for you anymore. I'm sorry, but I've made my choice. I felt the ground slipping from beneath me. This was at the end of everything we had built. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we shared, was gone. Then it's over, I said, my voice hollow. We're done. Amy didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at me with that same distant look, like she had already moved on and I was nothing more than a relic of her past. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. My heart was shattered, but one thing was clear. There was no going back from this. After that night, there was no need for further conversation. The decision was made, and the cold reality settled in. Amy had checked out long before I caught on, and now, all that was left to do was unravel the tangled mess of what had once been our life together. It wasn't going to be easy, but there was no other choice. The next few days were a blur. I contacted a lawyer immediately. I wasn't about to let Amy walk away with everything we had built together. I knew the law would be on my side, especially after I showed the lawyer the mountain of evidence I had gathered: text messages, receipts, photos. There would be no sympathy for her once the truth came out. The divorce proceedings started soon after. I wasn't sure what to expect: anger, guilt, regret, but Amy acted like it was just another inconvenience, another step she had to take to move on with her new life. She didn't fight me on most things, which should have been a relief, but somehow, it only made it worse. There was no remorse, no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. She just wanted out, and fast. Sitting across from her in the lawyer's office felt like staring at a stranger. Gone was the woman I had spent years building a life with, the woman I thought I would grow old with. In her place was someone I barely recognized: cold, detached, and more concerned with what she could take from the divorce than with what she had destroyed. The division of assets was surprisingly quick. We had been married long enough, and since there were no children, things were fairly straightforward. Half of everything. That's what I was entitled to, and I made sure I got it. Half of the house, half of the cars, and most importantly, half of the money. That $20 million that had once felt like the key to a better life now felt like a cursed prize, a trophy that symbolized everything we had lost. But I wasn't about to let her keep it all. The money was as much mine as it was hers, and I was going to make sure I left this marriage with what was rightfully mine. Amy barely blinked when the settlement was finalized. I could see she was eager to move on, probably already thinking about her next adventure with Luke, or whoever else was waiting in the wings. She had her freedom now, and clearly, that was all she cared about. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt an odd mixture of relief and emptiness. It was over. The years we spent together, the love we once had, the life we had built, it was all reduced to a few signatures on a stack of legal documents. I had walked into that marriage with hope, and now I was walking out with half of everything, including a broken heart. In the weeks following the divorce, the house became a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I couldn't stand being in it anymore. Every room echoed with memories of the life Amy and I once shared, but now they felt like ghosts, haunting me at every turn. So, I sold the house. I couldn't care less about the profit. At that point, I just needed to get away. I wanted to leave the past behind, to start fresh somewhere far away from the wreckage of my marriage. I bought a new place, nothing fancy, but big enough for me to start over. I didn't need much anymore. I was living for myself now, free from the lies and betrayal. I spent the first few months trying to adjust to this new reality, but the silence was deafening. Without Amy's presence, without the constant stress of our crumbling marriage, I realized just how lonely I was. The money didn't fill the void. No matter how many new things I bought, no matter how many distractions I tried to throw at myself, but I wasn't about to sit around wallowing in self-pity. If Amy had moved on, then so would I. It was time for me to live again, to stop being the man who had been betrayed and start being the man who took back control of his life. And that's when I met Sarah. Sarah worked at the grocery store where I used to shop before everything fell apart. She was younger than me by a good 10 years, vibrant, and full of energy in a way that reminded me of how Amy used to be. But there was something different about Sarah. She was kind, genuine, and showed me the kind of attention I hadn't felt in years. At first, I wasn't sure if I was ready. My divorce was still fresh, and part of me felt guilty for even thinking about being with someone else so soon. But then I remembered Amy's betrayal, how she had so easily moved on with Luke, and suddenly, I didn't feel so guilty anymore. If she could move on without looking back, then why couldn't I? I started spending more time with Sarah, getting to know her, feeling alive again in a way I hadn't in years. It was casual at first, just coffee, small conversations, but it quickly grew into something more. We were drawn to each other, and before I knew it, we were spending nights together. It felt good. It felt right. And it was the perfect way to close the chapter on my marriage with Amy. Revenge wasn't something I had ever thought I would seek, but being with Sarah felt like my way of taking back control. It wasn't just about moving on. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and showing Amy that I didn't need her anymore. In the end, I had gotten what I wanted, my freedom, my half of the money, and a fresh start. As for Amy, I heard through the grapevine that her relationship with Luke didn't last. I wasn't surprised, but that was no longer my concern. I had moved on, and for the first time in a long time, I was finally at peace. For a while, the divorce left me feeling hollow. Even after selling the house and moving into my new place, the loneliness crept in. The silence that once brought relief now felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. Amy was gone, and the life we had built together was nothing more than a string of memories I tried to forget. But I wasn't the kind of man to sit and wallow in self-pity forever. I knew I needed to move on, and part of me craved something more, something that would help me close the door on my past for good. That's when Sarah came into my life. Sarah wasn't just a distraction, she was exactly what I needed to feel alive again. At first, she was just a familiar face at the grocery store I'd frequented for years, but as soon as I started talking to her, I knew she was different. She was younger, full of energy and ambition, and in many ways, she reminded me of how Amy used to be before the money, before the betrayal, before everything went wrong. But unlike Amy, Sarah wasn't cold or distant. She was warm, with a sense of kindness that I hadn't felt in years. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to jump into anything serious, especially after everything I had been through. Part of me still carried the scars of Amy's betrayal, and I wasn't sure I could trust anyone again. But Sarah was persistent, and slowly, she started breaking down the walls I had built around myself. We began by talking casually at first, just small conversations whenever I saw her at the store. But those talks became longer, and eventually, we started grabbing coffee together. There was something about her that made me forget the pain I had been carrying. She wasn't just someone to fill the void. She was a breath of fresh air in a life that had been suffocating me for far too long. As the weeks passed, things between us grew more serious. I found myself drawn to her in ways I hadn't expected. Sarah made me feel young again, vibrant, and most importantly, desired. It wasn't long before we spent more and more time together, going from casual coffee dates to dinners and long conversations late into the night. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about reclaiming my sense of self-worth. Amy had made me feel small, unimportant, like I wasn't enough. But Sarah reminded me that I was still worthy of love, of attention. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my life again, like I wasn't the one being discarded. I was the one choosing. The first time Sarah and I spent the night together, I won't lie, it felt like sweet revenge. In the back of my mind, I couldn't help but think about Amy. She had betrayed me, thrown our marriage away for a fling with some other guy, and here I was, finally taking something back for myself. Being with Sarah wasn't just about starting over. It was about taking control of my narrative. I wasn't going to let Amy's betrayal define me anymore. Sarah was everything Amy wasn't. She was kind, attentive, and genuinely cared about how I felt. The more time I spent with her, the more I realized that this wasn't just about revenge or moving on. It was about finding someone who made me feel valued again. With Sarah, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself or fight for her attention. She gave it to me freely, without hesitation. There was a night when I truly felt the weight of my revenge sink in. Sarah and I had gone out to dinner at a nice restaurant, one of those upscale places I could afford now that I had my share of the lottery money. As we sat there, laughing and talking, I noticed a familiar figure at a table across the room. It was Amy. She was sitting alone, sipping a glass of wine, her phone in her hand. The confident, carefree woman I had once known looked different, tired, maybe even a little lost. She glanced up and saw me with Sarah, her eyes widening in surprise. I could see the flash of recognition, followed by something else: jealousy, regret. I wasn't sure. But in that moment, I knew. Amy's relationship with Luke had ended a few weeks after our divorce, as I had heard through mutual acquaintances. She had jumped into her new life thinking she could replace me, replace what we had, but clearly, that hadn't worked out the way she had planned. And now, here she was, sitting alone while I was with someone who made me feel whole again. I caught her eye briefly, just long enough to acknowledge her, and then I turned back to Sarah, who was laughing at something I had said. It was a small, insignificant moment, but it was the moment I knew I had won. Not in some childish game of who's better off, but in the sense that I had taken control of my own happiness. I had moved on. Amy had betrayed me, but she hadn't broken me. That night, Sarah and I went back to my place. As we lay in bed afterward, her head resting on my chest, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I had spent so long being angry, hurt, consumed by Amy's betrayal, but now, it all seemed so far away. Sarah was my fresh start, my chance to rebuild my life in a way that wasn't defined by the pain of the past. Was it revenge? Maybe, in some ways. But it was also about reclaiming my dignity, my sense of self. Amy's betrayal had crushed me, but I had risen from the ashes, stronger than before. And as I lay there, holding Sarah close, I realized something: revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about finding happiness again, despite everything that had been taken from me. In the end, my revenge wasn't about Amy at all. It was about me. I had moved on, found someone who appreciated me, and left the past behind where it belonged. And for the first time in a long time, I was finally free. The months that followed were like a breath of fresh air, a new beginning I never thought I'd have after everything that happened with Amy. Life with Sarah was simple, honest, and free from the emotional turmoil that had once suffocated me. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. But as much as I tried to move on from the past, there was always a part of me that lingered in the shadows, wondering if the scars Amy left would ever fully heal. Sarah and I became inseparable. She was the light in a life that had once been overshadowed by betrayal and heartbreak. We spent our weekends exploring new places, traveling to cities I had never been to, eating at restaurants I never imagined I could afford before the lottery win. Sarah loved the spontaneity of it all, the freedom, the luxury, the life we were building together. And for once, I didn't feel guilty for enjoying it. After everything I had been through, I deserved this happiness. Yet, there were moments when I would catch myself thinking of Amy, not out of longing or regret, but out of curiosity. What had become of her? What had she gained from all the choices she made? I didn't seek out answers, but life has a way of showing you the truth when you least expect it. One afternoon, about a year after the divorce, I ran into an old friend of ours, James, at a cafe downtown. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce, and I figured he had sided with Amy after everything. Still, he waved me over with a friendly smile, and before I knew it, we were catching up over coffee. "Man, you look good, Jake," he said, glancing at the window where Sarah was waiting outside. "New girlfriend, I take it?" "Yeah," I replied, smiling. "That's Sarah. She's something special." James nodded, sipping his coffee before he leaned in, his expression turning serious. "And Amy? You heard about her?" I felt a pang in my chest, the old wounds stirring slightly. "Not really. I've tried to leave all that behind." "Why? What's going on?" James sighed, setting his cup down. "She's not doing too well, man. After you two split, she stayed with that Luke guy for a while, but it fell apart pretty fast. She tried to hold on to the lifestyle, the parties, the spending, but it caught up with her. I heard she's been struggling. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. There was no satisfaction in hearing that Amy's life had taken a downturn. I wasn't the type to wish ill on anyone, even her. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think of how she had thrown everything away: our marriage, our stability, our future for a fling, for a thrill that didn't last. Now she was paying the price. "Struggling how?" I asked, my voice careful, not wanting to sound too interested. James shrugged. "Financially, mostly. Turns out blowing through a few $1,000,000 isn't that hard when you're living like a celebrity. She sold the house you guys had, moved into a smaller place. I don't know the details, but from what I've heard, it hasn't been easy for her." I took that in quietly. It wasn't hard to imagine. Amy had always chased the next big thing, the next thrill, never satisfied with what she had. The money had given her wings, but now it seemed like those wings had burned out. "I hope she's okay," I finally said, surprising even myself with the sincerity in my voice. As much as she had hurt me, I didn't want her to suffer. James gave me a knowing look, his eyes softening. "You're a good guy, Jake. Better than most would be in your situation." We finished our coffee, said our goodbyes, and as I walked out of the cafe, I glanced at Sarah, who was smiling brightly as she waited for me. She was my future, my second chance, and I wasn't going to let the past keep dragging me down. That night, as we sat on the porch of our new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I told Sarah about the conversation with James. I half expected her to brush it off, but she listened intently, nodding along, her hand resting on mine. "Do you feel bad for her?" Sarah asked gently. I thought about it for a moment, staring out at the fading light. "Not bad, exactly. I don't know. Maybe I just didn't expect her to fall so far. For a long time, she seemed untouchable, like nothing could get to her. But I guess that's what happens when you live your life chasing after temporary highs." Sarah smiled softly. "People like that don't realize what they've lost until it's too late. You were different. You saw what mattered." I nodded, taking in her words. "Yeah, I guess I did." As time went on, I found myself thinking about Amy less and less. The memories of our marriage faded, replaced by the life Sarah and I were building together. We talked about the future, about traveling more, maybe even starting a family. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The anger, the resentment, the need for revenge, they were gone, replaced by something much deeper: contentment. But one day, something unexpected happened. I received a letter in the mail from Amy. It was short, barely a page long, but it was enough to stir up all the emotions I thought I had buried. In it, she apologized not just for the affair, but for everything: for taking me for granted, for choosing greed and excitement over the stability and love we once had. She admitted that she had made mistakes, and though she didn't expect forgiveness, she wanted me to know she was sorry. I sat with the letter for hours, not knowing how to respond, or if I should respond at all. Part of me wanted to tear it up, throw it away, and never think about it again. But another part of me, the part that had healed, the part that had moved on, understood that this letter wasn't about reopening old wounds. It was about closing them for good. In the end, I didn't write back. There was no need. Amy's chapter in my life was over. The apology wasn't for me, it was for her. A way for her to make peace with her own choices. I had already made peace with mine. As I stood on the porch that evening, looking out at the life I had rebuilt, I realized that the final chapter of this story wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about moving on, about finding happiness again after the storm had passed. And I had found it with Sarah, with the new life we were creating together, and with the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's letting go.